And about 25 years ago, I took an interest in living history. I went to an event where I saw some living history people. In fact, I saw a guy in a great kilt. I knew from my background that my family was Scottish way back. They all kind of fell together. I decided to start doing living history as theater, as history, as performance, and as a way to work with nonprofit organizations for them, presentations and public speaking and things like that. The St. Andrews Societies were named after St. Andrew, the patron saint of Scotland. This one happens to be one of the very oldest around, and it runs the oldest Highland Games in North America. It became obvious to me that Detroit's not that far from where I live, and that this is an organization I would want to join. I managed to shake society up just about as much as they managed to change me, so it's turned out pretty well in the end. It's been a good fit. I love the St. Andrews Society and the work they do, and I'm very, very happy to be able to participate not only in their events, but to represent the St. Andrews Society at events all over North America and Scotland. Because a benevolent organization, a nonprofit organization that supports, promotes the culture and histories of people is a great thing for all of us. Well, haggis gets a bad rap. A lot of people pick on haggis that don't understand haggis. Even Scots like to make fun of haggis. They pretend that it's an animal and you can hunt them, and they talk about eating them and throwing them. And haggis is famous because we've gone out of our way to make it famous, quite frankly. We've made it famous because we have to justify eating the stuff. The interesting things about haggis are how it evolved and why somebody would have ever thought that you're supposed to cook up the heart, the lung, and the liver, mix it with oatmeal, and cook it in a stomach. Somebody rich and famous and important ate all the best parts of the animal, and you've got what's left. You got to do something with it. Haggis is what you do with the sheep to make it palatable. And it's a good way to prepare the dish, to store the dish, to carry the dish, and serve the dish to use the sheep's stomach. A lot of other haggises under other titles, they use the intestines and they fill them like sausage casing. We use the stomach. I guess we wanted ours bigger and more platter-like than long and skinny. Okay? But it's not that type of food dish is unique to Scots. We've worked hard to make it what it is in legend and lore. Oh, he's going to eat haggis. But if you sit down and eat a hot dog or a bratwurst, you're a step below haggis, because we're smart enough as Scots to put oats in ours. They just put more fat in theirs. Who knows what a haggis is? Well, I would think with this crowd I should see at least a few hands. And there's a couple Irish guys in the back that are scratching their heads, but we'll get to them in a minute. Somebody tell me what a haggis is. Pudding. Pudding. Yeah, that's a good answer. Just be quiet. Who knows what a haggis is?
Sheep and oatmeal.
It's what?
Sheep parts and oatmeal.
Sheep parts and oatmeal. That's a good answer. I like that one. That's a start. Anybody else want to add?
With a little spice.
With a little spice. All right. Well, we'll correct your impression there. Okay. What else?
Organ meats.
Organ meat. We like that. Organ? You could play it? No. All right. You're all thinking of haggis as the food, like what it's made from, and we'll get to that in a minute. But what you really need to know about a haggis is this. Haggis is the national dish of Scotland unofficially. All right, so that's not official, but it's the national dish of Scotland. Every culture that you know of has a haggis. They just call it something else. Okay? They make haggis all over the world because haggis is the part of the animal that's left after rich people eat all the good stuff. If I knock down a steer, rich people eat the steaks and the roasts and all the other good parts, and what are you left with? The snout and the tail. Okay? Why do you think they make, calf's head soup and oxtail soup? Because you're left with the snout and the tail. Right? If I knock down a hog, what do rich people get? The loins and the hams and the bacon and the pork chops. What do you get? The feet and the snout. That's why they make pickled pig feet. Every culture has a haggis. It's the part of an animal made out of what's left over after rich people eat all the good stuff. And looking at this crowd, most of you don't have 2 dimes to rub together. So I'm thinking you ought to know what a haggis is and how to make it. Now, when I make a haggis, what do I have to start with? go back to the early part. What do you need to make a haggis? Bah. A sheep. God. What kind of crowd is this? So now I used to work with real sheep. I mean live sheep. Okay. But at the Highland Games, whenever we borrowed a sheep from a guy who had the sheep and dog show, he was never really very happy when we brought the sheep back in a different condition than it arrived. Consequently, I've been forced to bring my own sheep. This is Bob. Say hi to Bob. Bob the sheep. Now, Bob lives where do sheep live? In a field. Stay with me here. They live outside in a field. And what do sheep do? Grass. They eat grass. So you have to imagine Bob in the field, Bob eating. Bah, bah, eat in the field. Now, some things happen to Bob between the field and the kitchen. Okay? We're going to skip over that part lightly. So here's Bob in the field. Grass, grass, grass. Here's Bob in the kitchen. Now remember, where'd all the good parts go? Rich people ate them. So what are we left with? The not so good parts. All right. What's this? Intestines. Oh, you paid attention in biology class. Okay, smart girl. If these are the intestines, then this is the large, and this is the small. Remember, they are connected. Wow, look at that. Bob's been eating daisies. Okay. In Scotland, we call this guts or entrails. We don't eat this stuff. No sane human would eat this. We feed it to the dogs. When you're cleaning up after the rich people and you're picking out the parts left for the haggis, you take the entrails, the guts, you throw them to your hounds. So this is dog food. Okay? We'll just put this over here. Now, to make a haggis, you have to think about what a haggis really is in forms of the kitchen aspect of a haggis. A haggis is essentially a meatloaf. It's ground up, chopped up meat, mixed with some filler, and you cook it in a thing, and then you get it out and you eat it, right? To make the meatloaf, besides the food ingredients, stay with me here, you Irish guys in the back. What do you need to make the meatloaf in? A pan. Do we have a meatloaf pan 300 years ago? No. Bob will provide. You go to Bob and you get Bob's stomach. Okay, those of you that really have a clue, just be quiet. It's easier to tell the story. Bob's stomach. Now, when you get the stomach out of Bob, make sure you leave plenty of room on both ends. You want to rinse this out, okay? You want to rinse it well in cold salted water. Don't poke any holes in the stomach because you don't want the meatloaf pan to leak, right? Keep it damp, set it aside. Remember, this is your meatloaf pan. Now, a haggis has three central things that come out of Bob. We call them the pluck. And they are this. The lungs. That's one of the three. Now you can parboil this or you can chop it up raw and then cook it. There's several ways to do it. Most people kind of boil up the pluck first, but you don't have to. Anyway, you get the lungs out. Eventually they're going to be chopped up fine, and you're going to put them aside in a big bowl. Now, then you got to have the livers. Right? That's part number 2 of the pluck. Right? And you're going to either parboil it or chop it up and then cook it. Either way, you're going to make a haggis out of it, chop it up fine. Mix it with the... Okay, stay with me here. Right? And the third thing that goes in the pluck comes out of Bob is, now we try to make this easy to identify. The English have a lot of trouble with this. They don't recognize it because they don't have one. The heart. So the pluck is made up of the heart, and what do you do with these? Chop them up fine and put them in a bowl. Now you can boil them first or boil them second. Now sometimes, like people show up at your house you don't expect, and what do you do if you're making soup? You add more water, right? Sometimes you want to stretch the haggis, you can throw in the kidneys. I don't recommend this. I don't like kidneys. I don't want them in my haggis, but occasionally. We used to have a guy who'd been a Glasgow butcher. And he said that until he retired in about 1980, he used to make up to 200 haggis a week in his butcher shop. And about 1 out of 20, some woman wanted the kidneys in there, so he'd throw them in. But I don't recommend it unless your relatives are coming and you don't want them to come back. Because I don't like to eat kidneys. Now, there's very little else in a haggis. The meat consists of the pluck, heart, lung, and liver. You have to have some suet. Suet's a fancy French word for fat. Okay? Just a little aside here, don't use mutton tallow, use beef suet. Okay? And that's the kind of the binder that's going to hold the meat together and make this a rich dish to eat. You also have to have filler. We use oatmeal. I don't quite know how that got in Bob, but okay. We use oatmeal, and you want whole rolled oats, not that garbage that you make in a microwave. I want all the oats with all the parts. So now you need a couple of more things. Somebody said spice earlier. A little salt and pepper is acceptable, but you also need... Oh, good. Right, 3 of you. Onion, yeah. The rest of them, I don't know. Okay, here's the math part of the test here. If 1 onion is good, 2. This is 2. 1, 2. Okay, 2 onions. Good, yes. Chopped up fine. Mixed with the, and the, that's a liver. And the, and this one, right, except for the English, they're clueless. And a little bit of suet. The pluck, heart, lung, and liver. Oatmeal, onion, salt and pepper, and suet. That's it. If that's not in the haggis, it's not a haggis. If you put anything else in it, it's not a haggis. You can't jolly well make vegetarian haggis. Okay? You can't make beef haggis. You can't take lamb chops and grind them up and put that in there and call it haggis. That's a lamb meatloaf. Haggis is a very specific dish. You make it about one way. If it's not in there, it's not haggis. All right? Now, what do we got to make it in? The meatloaf pan, Bob's stomach. You got a big sheep, you got a big meatloaf pan, you get a big haggis. You got a small sheep, you got a small stomach, you got a small pan, you make a small haggis. All the ingredients, remember, have been chopped up very fine and mixed together in a big bowl. Now you'd be stuffing all that into here. Maybe you parboiled the pluck first, maybe you didn't. Doesn't really matter. All right, the pluck. And remember, this is all mixed up, right? The oatmeal, the suet. We'll throw the kidneys in. It's kind of a big crowd. All right, couple of onions, salt and pepper. There it is. Tie the end shut. Cook it. Boil it. Boil it till it's done. It's done when the meat's cooked, if it's not already. When the onions are cooked and when the oatmeal is cooked and it swells up, it'll stretch the stomach. All right? It'll look like this when you bring it out. But more importantly, it'll look like this when you bring it out. And that's a haggis. No, we're not done yet. Stop. Thank you. Want to set that right there? Now, at breakfast, when you go to eat breakfast at a good Scottish bed and breakfast, and you will stay in bed and breakfast, by the way, never stay in tourist hotels. It looks like this on the plate. There's the haggis. See? It kind of comes out halfway between a meatloaf and corned beef hash. All right? There's haggis, sausages, black pudding, grilled tomato, grilled mushroom, fried egg, fried bacon, fried bread. No cholesterol. This is a good breakfast. You have this after you eat cereal, oatmeal, fruit, coffee, tea, toast, and yogurt. Okay? Now, the black pudding. You know, we used to do a black pudding demonstration, but I had to stop. It's really gross. Okay? The haggis is, what, a few, heart, lung, liver. There's nothing to that. But black pudding, rotting blood and oatmeal? No. Okay. No black pudding demo. Now, what did I tell you when we started? Every country has a haggis. They just call it something else because it's a national dish made out of the parts of the animal after rich people eat the good stuff. In Germany, they make haggis. They call it bratwurst. In Poland, they make haggis. They call it kielbasa. In Mexico, they make a haggis. They call it a burrito. In Louisiana, they make haggis. They call it boudin. Right? In China, they make haggis. They call it an egg roll. Everybody has haggis. The United States of America has a haggis. You call yours hot dogs. But remember this part? What do we call this in Scotland? The guts, the entrails. When they make bratwurst, knotwurst, kielbasa, chorizo, andouille, hot dogs, and all that other stuff, they use this part. They stuff the meat in here, they twist this off, they cook that up, and people sit around on the 4th of July celebrating American independence, eating Scottish dog food. Don't call us barbarians, but do call me to dinner. Thank you. Obviously, there's a great clan association with Scots in Scottish history. So I look at the story as the Clan MacFarlane. Now, Clan MacFarlane is a very small clan. It's always been small. More than 200 years ago, they lost most of their lands. They don't even currently have a chief. We're a broken clan, as they say. So what we have left is those historical traditions and stories about what the clan has done and how we got to where we are. And one of the more unique things about Clan MacFarlane is the crest that we have. That's a bare-chested Scotsman with a raised sword and his hand on a crown. And it says, "This I'll defend." When you look at how Scottish clan crests evolve and why they look like that, very few of them have a crown in them, because it's not acceptable to put a crown in there unless that was granted to you by a member of royalty. And the MacFarlanes were given that after the Battle of Langslide in 1568. They defended the crown. They defended King James against the army that had come to overthrow him. Now, the fact that he was a baby and it was his mother's army coming to overthrow him, that's all. We don't worry so much about that. But that's how we got "This I'll defend." That's how we got the crown on our crest. That's how we got 3 in 1 day as our kind of our motto, because we took 3 of Queen Mary's standards in that battle. So Langslide to us is very pivotal. But when you look at it, when you look at Scottish history and you go, what would have changed if Mary Queen of Scots got back on the throne in 1568, having abdicated just 2 years earlier? All of Scottish history and English history would have been different after that. James could have never been King of England after Elizabeth died many years later, because he would have been raised a Catholic instead of a Protestant. Mary probably would have ruled a long time, might have been married, had more children. The whole history of the relationship between Scotland and England would have been different, because there would have been no union of the crowns in the early 1600s. The relationship between Scotland and England and France would have been different. The settlement in North America, if James isn't king, you can't have Jamestown. You wouldn't have had the King James Bible, because it was the Protestants who wanted the Bible in the English language that people could read. So you look at that and say, here's where Scottish history changed because of this battle, and most people never heard about it. Sometimes, as a famous Greek once said, "I cannot fiddle, but I can make a great state from a small city." In 1568, Mary Queen of Scots was locked up in a castle on an island in Loch Lomond. Mary Queen of Scots had abdicated her throne, and they'd put her infant son James I on in her place. There was a lot of conflict in Scotland at the time. Catholic, Protestant, whether a woman could rule. The whole John Knox was not happy with Mary Queen of Scots, and many of her lords were not happy either. Her infant son was being raised by his uncle, who was the regent and ruled for the infant, and Mary was not happy. She wasn't really that old. She wasn't even 30 years old yet. She had been Queen of France earlier until the King of France died, and she came back to rule in Scotland. Mary managed to gather a few men around her and escape from her castle where she was prisoner. And upon reaching the shore, she began to raise an army as she moved west across Scotland. She knew that if she could reach Dunbarton Castle, her troops could rally, she could raise an army, she could take back her throne, because she had enough men to do it, maybe. She could take her son back from her brother-in-law. She could rule Scotland again and raise her son James to be a good Catholic instead of a Protestant. And if that had happened, if she had been successful, the entire course of Scottish, English, French, and probably American history would have changed. dramatically. Mary raised an army of over 6,000 men as she moved across Scotland to the west. To oppose her, the regent for King James, an infant, raised an army of between 3,000 and 4,000 men. Normally, this would be a considerable disadvantage. However, Mary, Queen of Scots' very large army was led by a very poor general. Now, as Mary's army began to move, they tried to continue to outflank those coming to oppose them. The two armies maneuvered themselves, one coming basically west and south, trying to get around Glasgow to the south, cross the Clyde, the other coming almost straight down. And it was pretty clear by the 12th of May, 1568, that the two would meet somewhere to the south and just a bit east of the city of Glasgow. There's a small village there called Langside. Now, Langside's unimportant anywhere else in Scottish history, really, and most people don't even remember it exists because now it's a suburb of Glasgow. But Langside in that day was a completely separate town, south and just a bit east of Glasgow, and it was a crossroad of two main roads. The race was on, as they say. Mary's poorly led large army moving swiftly, the regent bringing the army with him south to cut her off. They both crossed the Clyde River. The regent's army got the high ground and the village of Langside, and Mary formed up to the east of the town. The battle was on, May the 13th, 1568. Now, I tell you all that part so I can tell you this part. The MacFarlanes lived in Lomanside, which would be the northwest shore of Loch Lomond. The MacFarlanes were not fans of Mary, Queen of Scots. In fact, they'd not been fans of whoever was king or queen for quite some time. More than 100 years before, they had laid claim to the earldom of Lennox. At one point, it was within their grasp and taken from them. Her half-brother, who was regent, ruling for an infant King James, and he sent word to them that he needed their support in this coming fight with Mary's army. As it turned out, they were the only Highland clan that could respond, being close enough and allied with James I of England, James V of Scotland. And they came. Now, word reached MacFarlane's late in the afternoon or early evening of the 12th of May. By the time the Lord MacFarlane, Duncan was his name, could raise his men and gather a few MacGregors from across the top of Loch Lomond. MacGregors, as you know, are always looking for a fight. They'll fight anybody. It keeps them from fighting each other. He had with him about 300 men. They left Lomanside probably after midnight. So let's say early morning of May 13th. And they ran all night. Through the dark, down the entire basic west bank of Loch Lomond, around the end of Loch Lomond, across the south end of Loch Lomond, past Ballach, past the Priory, on and on they ran. It's near 30 miles from Lomanside to Langside, south of Glasgow. While they ran, they carried with them weapons only and a few meager portions of an early version of black pudding in their sporrans, which was basically cow's blood and oatmeal mixed together. And as you run, it kind of sets up in your sporran. And when you get hungry, you just dip in there with one hand on the move and pull it out by the handful and stuff at home. It being very good protein. Now, you and I might think that that distance under those conditions would be impossible for a Highlander, but it's not. And they've done it many times in history. And the MacFarlanes and the MacGregor allies took off running from Lomanside in the middle of the night and ran all night. It was not uncommon for Highlanders to be able to run 25 or 30 miles in a day, but to do it at night in that country was a considerable feat. Remember, they didn't have lights or lanterns. In fact, they had a bit of a moon. I will say this, however, because MacFarlane's is a clan famous for one particular trait. Besides the fact they like to fight. They can see in the dark. In fact, in Scotland to this very day, the moon itself is known as MacFarlane's lantern, because all they need of light at night is a bit of moon or a few bright stars, and they can track, they can run, they can move, they can even lift a few cattle occasionally, with no lanterns and no additional lights. So with the MacFarlanes leading, they ran through the night. They actually got to Glasgow probably early morning. The sun was already up. They discovered at that point that the armies were going to be in battle across the river at Langside. They crossed the Clyde. They actually got to Langside probably about half an hour after the battle started. Now, the battle itself was a very traditionally fought thing at the first. The bad general with the big army for Mary Queen of Scots had divided his forces into three parts. He put his heavy mounted cavalry on the outside, the heavy cavalry with armor on and great swords and axes. By the time the MacFarlanes arrived, the two wings, mounted cavalry and fast-moving troops of Queen Mary's army, were attacking both the left flank and the right flank of the Regent's army. The pivotal battle was going to be in the center. The general for Queen Mary of Scots sent the main portion of his army straight forward into the village of Langside, where the musket men and a few hidden men with crossbows attacked from behind bushes, trees, walls, and houses. And there was a fierce fight in the village. And at this point, it became clear that even though the larger army was poorly led, sheer numbers alone would turn the day. If he could throw enough men at the Regent's forces, he could overpower them. He'd lose a lot of men doing it, but you can sweep over a smaller opponent, regardless of how well they're read, if you have enough men to do it. And that's where the battle was going to turn. It's also at this point that the MacFarlanes arrived. No rest, no sleep, no food. They ran 30 miles in the dark, and they hit Mary Queen of Scots' army in the right flank like hell's own tornado. Right through the center of the line. Legend has it that one MacFarlane even had his hand on the bridle of her horse before her lifeguards led her away. They were the only Highlanders in the fight. They were highly feared. Everybody else in the battle was a lowland Scot. They had no use for Highlanders. And when they saw those clubs and swords and axes coming, they got out of the way. The battle was over in short time. More than 600 dead, probably. Most of them killed right at the end. For their support, for their effort, for their work, the MacFarlanes earned three things. The right to have the crown of Scotland on their crest, which is on very few Scottish clan crests. The right to say on the crest, "This I'll defend," the crown of Scotland. And to have raised above it a sword of a Highlander defending the crown of King James. They also earned their battle honors, 3 in one day, because they took 3 of Mary Queen of Scots' royal standards in that battle. And those 3 flags hung in the house of the leader of Clan MacFarlane for many, many years afterwards. One small battle, 45 or 50 minutes in length total, maybe 8,000 men complete on both sides, 9 at the most. Very little recognized in history. I cannot fiddle, but from a small town I can make a great state. The whole modern state of Scotland came about after the Battle of Langside. Mary fled to England and threw herself at the mercy of Elizabeth I in England, and after 19 years of locked away, they cut off her head. James I became King of Scotland permanently, was raised up by his uncles, a series of regents. He's raised a Protestant. Mary, Queen of Scots, had raised her son to be a Catholic. When Elizabeth I died, he never could have taken the English throne. And the throne of England would have had to go into a different line, which means you would not have had the Hanoverians later, none of the Georges, and probably not the current queen on the throne today. You wouldn't have had the King James Bible, the first and many people believe the best English language version of the Bible. You wouldn't have had Jamestown settlement in the New World, in what's now the United States. Most of history as we know it would have changed had Mary Queen of Scots regained the throne. She came from a long-lived family. Her cousins lived a long time. Her parents, she easily could have ruled another 40 or 50 years. She wasn't that old at the time. She would have been much more closely allied with France because she had been queen in France, don't forget, before this. From a small battle, from one moment in time. In a small town that really doesn't exist anymore, a few thousand men on a desperate morning, Langside, May the 13th, 1568. I cannot fiddle, but I can make a great state like Scotland from a small village like Langside. And that's the way history turned. Thank you. Because you see, MacFarlane is well known for his dogs. He's known throughout Scotland for dogs. He raises dogs, all types of dogs. He had big dogs for hunting. He had wolfhounds and deerhounds, and he had big dogs for herding sheep. He had small dogs for going into rock formations and pulling out the weasels and the rats. He had ratters for the larder. He had great fighting pit bulls. He had every kind of dog you can imagine. He had them trained well, and he expected them to work. He was a good dog, man. He had setters and pointers and retrievers and even dogs that like to go fishing. And despite that, when he looks at the small puppy on the bench, it was hard to describe. It didn't look like any other dog. And every time you ran your hand over it, it kind of slicked off and the hair came with it. It sheds a lot but never seems to go bald. Well, the man is gone. MacFarlane can't ask any questions, but he can raise the dog as he assumes he was intended to do. And he thinks, this is fine. I'll raise the dog. I like dogs. It'll fit right in. And over the next months, as time goes, MacFarlane tries to train the dog to do things. It doesn't hunt. It won't retrieve, it doesn't point, it doesn't herd cattle, it won't go after the sheep, it won't get in the boat, it doesn't chase deer, it doesn't go into the rock pile after the weasels, right? It won't go to the larder and chase the rats. In short, the dog can't be trained to do anything except eat. It likes to eat. It eats and eats and eats and eats and grows and eats and grows and eats and sleeps. MacFarlane had determined that he was not going to name the dog until he decided what the dog was good for. And since the dog doesn't apparently be good for anything, it never requires a name. He calls it dog. His friends and neighbors refer to it as MacFarlane's joke or the great comedy of MacFarlane's dog because they make fun of him a lot. Having known as he was for the quality of his dogs of all types, now MacFarlane has friends and he's well known and he's hospitable and people come to see him and he does things with them. And after a while his friends come to recognize that the dog is huge and a burden, and even his wife says you should take it out and drown it, get rid of that silly dog, it's worthless. And his friends kind of make fun of him because anytime they're ever at MacFarlane's house, this huge, shedding, massive eating, giant sleeping dog is laying around in the way someplace. But MacFarlane is determined to keep the dog, despite the fact that his friends and relatives all tell him to haul it out to the middle of the loch and drown the thing, because it'd save us half of the food budget around this house. Well, as time goes, years go by, the dog grows even bigger. One time his friends come over and they want him to go fishing. So he goes and he gets the things to fish. And just as he gets to the boat, the dog appears. And as he tried to get in the boat, the dog stood in front of him. And every time he tried to get around the dog stood in front of him. And his friends in the boat were laughing their heads off. They were, MacFarlane, you're a fool. The dog is worthless. Kick the dog, get in the boat. In fact, bring the dog with you. We'll haul it out in the middle of the loch and we'll throw it in and you'll be rid of this big eating worthless mutt. No. Wait a minute. He tried everything he could. The dog wouldn't let him in the boat. Finally, he says, go on, go fishing. I'll sort this out later. Maybe the dog's afraid of boats. I don't know. His friends leave, and MacFarlane heads back up to the house. And by the time he gets back up to the house, he looks up, and there's the dog asleep in front of the fire again, having just finished off about 3 sides of venison and 4 large bowls of milk. Did I tell you the dog likes to eat? It's an eating dog, and it's big. Well, he's a bit upset because he really wanted to go fishing, and he really not quite sure what's up with the dog. When the next day he discovers that his friends who had gone out in this boat had gotten way out in the loch when a storm blew up, so bad that the boat sank and they barely made it to shore swimming. And when he heard this, he was a bit glad he hadn't gone. And after he'd been told the story, he goes into the sword room by the fire, and he looks at the dog, and the dog looks at him. And then it went back to sleep. Now, time continues. The dog gets bigger, the years go by. At this point, his family and friends have given up telling him how worthless the dog is. They just learn to walk around it and try not to sit down in the shed hair. MacFarlane one night is visited by some friends up the valley who bring him a great tale of woe. Unknown to him where he is, but some miles away, cattle and sheep have been disappearing. Great, terrible, howling sounds have been heard in the night. Large pieces of tree have been found ripped down as if destroyed by a great storm or a huge beast. If that wasn't bad enough, a couple of men who went to investigate their missing cattle had never come back. MacFarlane, being well known as he was and having this great pack of huge dogs, which everybody knew could hunt, was asked to join this small party of hardy souls and head up into the mountains to see if they could discover what it was that had taken the sheep and the cattle and the men. Well, he went to the wall and he took his great two-hand sword off the wall and he called to himself about 6 or 8 or a dozen of his biggest dogs. He took the Rottweilers and the Mastiffs and the great Rhineland hounds. He took the deerhounds and the wolfhounds and a couple of the fighting pit bulls. And he and these few strong men with swords about them headed off up into the mountains. Now, in that part of Scotland, at some distance from MacFarlane's house, the ocean comes crashing into the coast of Scotland. And there are great cliffs there of 100 to 200 feet. And the land around there is very inhospitable. Not many people go there. It's not lived on, it can't be farmed. Even the sheep don't like to graze there. The rocks there date way back from when Scotland was an early country. Some of the caves in that area were thought to be remnants of old volcanoes, in fact. There are caves high up on the wall in this valley, some of which go all the way through and open on the cliffs over the ocean, so that they're actually open at each end. And when the wind blows just right off the ocean, the sound ripping through those caves, the howl through there like a huge pipe, is disturbing to anyone in the area. But they could tell pretty quickly as they moved up into this strange part of Scotland that they were on the right track, because they'd been to discover, they started seeing the bones, the ripped carcasses of cattle and sheep, long dead, and MacFarlane was glad he had his sword and his dogs and a few good men with him. Now, night began to fall before they got clear up into the area they were looking for, and became more and more clear that they were coming upon something none of them had ever seen. And then they began to hear sounds in the distance. And as they closed into the area of the caves high up on the wall of the valley, and some of which opened into the cliffs below, they found even more bones of large animals. And then they heard shouting and the yelling and the screaming and the howling of some huge beast. Well, the men stopped to girder up their loins, to tuck in their kilts, to unsheath their blades, to pull the collars off the dogs, and prepare themselves for what they'd rapidly come to understand was going to be quite a fight. MacFarlane was reminded in the back of his mind that he'd been a very small boy. A tinker had come through and told him a tale of a huge ogre, a beast, 17, 18, 20 feet tall. MacFarlane asked the old tinker about the beast, and the man says, you know, he captured me, and he kept me in a cage with sheep and cattle and some other men who were stupefied. And every day he would pull a few of us out and throw us in a huge kettle and cook it up, whatever went in. And then he'd reach in with his hand and pull them out of the boiling water and howl and shout when he burned his fingers. And after watching them for a couple of days and assuming eventually it'd be his turn, the tinker said, you know, I pulled an old wooden fork and spoon from my pocket and I showed it to the ogre. And using a mixture of English and Norse and Gaelic and Latin and sign language, I gave the huge beast to know that I would make for him a spoon and a fork big enough for him to use so that when he reached into the pot, it wouldn't hurt so much. He wouldn't have to yell and shout and howl. And good to his word, the tinker carved for him a large spoon and a large fork from a piece of wood and gave them to the ogre, and the ogre used them to pull the next carcass out of the huge pot, and was so distracted and happy that the tinker made his escape. Well, who would know that 30 or 40 or 50 years later, the same ogre would be back? And MacFarlane thought of this story at the time, and as a youth, he was mesmerized by these legends, and now he's thinking to himself, can it really be? They get to the mouth of the cave where the piles of sheep and cattle carcasses are the worst, and they can tell by the sounds and the smell and the sights around them that this is where the battle will be. They head into the cave, men and dogs. And when they get into the cave opens up into a large chamber, and there's a big fire and a huge cauldron and a pen area full of sheep and cows, and standing amidst a monstrous beast that must be 18, 17, maybe 20 feet tall. When they come in, he turns and looks upon them and lets out a roaring yell, and the battle begins. As the beast grabs a giant club, one in each hand, and starts to flail at MacFarlane and his friends and the dogs. And they all come at him at the same time. And the bodies are flying, and the dogs are barking and the howling, and the beast is yelling, and the men are screaming, and the swords are clashing. And the battle rages on for some time, but after a few minutes, it's clear that the beast will win. Most of the men are gone or wounded, and the dogs are all run off or been smashed and are in terrible condition. And it's down to 2 large dogs and MacFarlane himself, and the giant ogre stands before him, a club in each hand. And MacFarlane takes the great 2-hand sword from the wall in his house, and he wages himself into battle. And he manages to deftly step aside from the blow of the great club and slice through the ogre's arm and disarm him on that side, but he's not quick enough, for the other arm comes around and the club catches MacFarlane and sends him sprawling on the ground, and he's grievously wounded. The dogs are thrown off, and there's no fight left in them. And all MacFarlane can do is manage to raise up his sword just enough to protect himself as the next great blow rains down upon him. And he turns it aside, but he's going to have to close out his earthly accounts. And as he decides that one last time he'll try to stand and defend himself, the ogre knocks him aside and stands over him with the club and begins to raise it up to bring it down on MacFarlane's head. His sword no longer of any good to him. He uses what he can to pretend to protect himself, but he knows this is it. And as he looks up to the giant's face and he sees the club coming down, they hear a roar like no man has ever heard on this earth. A roar so loud, so great, so disconcerting that both MacFarlane and the ogre stop and look. And at that point, Dog, the great worthless eating dog of MacFarlane's hearth, roaring like no one can believe, leaps over MacFarlane through the air 8 or 10 feet off the ground, sinks its fangs into the ogre's neck, and the two of them go head over tails rolling, fighting it out, screaming, howling, barking, roaring, tooth and nail, through the back of the cave, rolling and fighting, scratching and biting, and right out the back of the cave, over the cliff, and 200 feet to the rocks in the ocean below. MacFarlane's barely able to stand. He gathers himself up, and at this point he's using his great 2-hand sword more as a crutch than a weapon. At the entrance to the cave, MacFarlane stops and listens to the wind for a moment, it being incredibly quiet. And he recognizes one thing that he'll always remember, and that you should always remember. Every dog has its day. Thank you. Now, How do you know that story's true and not just the legend it's alleged to be? I can show you why. MacFarlane went back and got the tinker's great spoon and fork and took them home and hung them on the mantle with the sword, and that's where you'll find them today. That's why it's true and not just a legend. Every dog has his day is an old Scottish legend. It's in various forms. It comes from various clans. Of the few written versions I've ever seen, most of them involve a giant hand, a huge green hand that attacks the hero of the story, and he's saved by the dog of some mystery. The every dog has its day story is a legend based on where we get that phrase from. Like a lot of legends, they end with a parable or a story or a fabled ending that's carried down through history. And the explanation of every dog has its day really is that no matter what you might think about a person, for instance, when you come down to it, everybody has some value in a unique way. And we can't all look at someone and determine that they're of no value because we don't recognize that in them. And we tell it using the dog rather than people. In most of the old Scottish stories, it's actually a black dog. But there are some versions where it's a dog where the color changes. I'm sure that probably there are giant mythical dogs that save their owners in other cultures as well. And for one reason or another, anytime I've heard it told or read a written version, the ending's always the same. The dog saves the guy and disappears. Every dog has his day. It's the story at the end. There's a scene with a boat and the fishing trip in every version I've ever heard or seen. The rest of the story changes dramatically depending on when and where it's told. It's one thing to tell stories. It's another thing to have a good audience when you tell stories. And a good audience of Scotsmen from an organization like St. Andrew's Society of Detroit, where I'm proudly a member and many of you are as well. That's the best audience of all, because you tell your stories with your friends. And then occasionally, they might even buy you a whiskey later. Thank you so much.